Most drivers believe the instant those emergency lights show up in their rearview mirror, the result is already determined. A citation, perhaps a warning, a brief period on the roadside, and then it concludes. But what if that whole belief is incorrect? What if the most critical part of that encounter occurs before the citation is even issued, before you even understand anything significant is taking place? Because every single day throughout American roadways, drivers unconsciously speak one phrase, just one, that silently surrenders their legal safeguards. And from that point forward, the stop is no longer just a stop. It transforms into something else completely. Searches occur, time extends, circumstances intensify, and the driver typically has no understanding why things suddenly went wrong. This isn't about extreme situations or unusual events. This is occurring to regular people on completely routine drives. The troubling part is how foreseeable it is. The same sequences, the same errors, the same results, and almost everyone misses it approaching until it's already too late. But once you comprehend exactly what's occurring in those initial moments and the particular rule that controls everything, you begin to view the entire encounter differently. And more significantly, you discover how a few strategically selected words can completely alter the direction of that stop before it ever has a chance to worsen. Hi, I'm June, and this is Visa Path USA, and I've dedicated a considerable amount of time examining actual traffic stop recordings over 200 body camera videos, dissecting exactly what occurs during those crucial first minutes on the side of the road. And what emerged wasn't forceful policing or theatrical confrontations. It was something much quieter and far more uniform. The drivers who concluded in the worst circumstances weren't necessarily doing anything severely wrong. They just didn't comprehend how the encounter actually functions. They responded to questions the way most people would. They attempted to be helpful, accommodating, truthful, and paradoxically, that's exactly what placed them at a disadvantage. In this video, I'm going to reveal the particular highway law dynamic that most drivers have never been educated about. The 3 exact phrases that can shield you immediately during a stop, and how a circumstance that typically extends for 20 minutes can instead be finished in less than 8. By the conclusion of this, you're going to view traffic stops in a completely different way, and you'll understand exactly what to say and when to say it, so you're not caught unprepared the next time those lights activate behind you. Here's where most people misunderstand it. And it's not because they're negligent. It's because they've been trained to believe a traffic stop is straightforward. You get stopped, provide your license and registration, respond to a few questions, and wait for the officer to determine what occurs next. It seems routine, almost mechanical. But that interpretation of reality omits something vital. A traffic stop is not just a roadside discussion. It's a structured legal encounter with very particular limits. And those limits are being evaluated from the very first second. Officers are instructed to use the opening moments of a stop to do more than verify a violation. They're examining your conduct, your tone, your replies, even your hesitation. Every word you speak is being analyzed, not casually, but as potential information. And while most drivers believe they're just being courteous or accommodating, what's actually occurring is that they're unknowingly helping construct a legal foundation that can justify prolonging the stop far beyond its original intent. This is where federal highway enforcement practices intersect directly with your constitutional rights, specifically your Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. And that intersection is exactly where things begin to change, because once that initial intent of the stop, say speeding or a broken taillight, starts to blur, the entire encounter can expand. More questions, more examination, more time, and it often begins so gradually that drivers don't even recognize the transition. But if you understand what to look for, you'll notice that it almost always starts the same way, with one question that sounds innocent, almost conversational, but carries far more significance than people realize. It usually arrives within seconds of the officer reaching your window. You've probably encountered it before, or you will at some point. Do you know why I pulled you over today? On the surface, it appears like a basic, even courteous way to begin the encounter. But this is not small talk. This is one of the most dependable and widely used techniques in any traffic stop because of what it encourages you to do next. The instant you respond with anything particular, you're no longer just answering a question. You're potentially making a verbal admission, and that matters more than most drivers comprehend. If you say, "I think I was going a little fast," you've just acknowledged speeding without viewing any evidence. If you say, "I might have drifted a bit," you've provided a justification that can be used to support further investigation. These statements don't just vanish, they get recorded, included in reports, and can later be referenced in court as part of the officer's account of the stop. And the reason this functions so consistently is because it feels natural. People want to be agreeable. They want to seem honest. So they fill in the silence with explanations that appear harmless in the moment, but carry real legal weight. Now, compare that to a response that keeps the encounter respectful without revealing anything away. Instead of guessing or admitting, you say, "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate fully. I don't believe I was doing anything wrong." That one sentence does something powerful. It demonstrates you're calm. You're not resisting, but you're also not volunteering information that could be used against you. You're allowing the officer to state their reason based on their observation, not your assumption. And that distinction matters because now the direction of the stop is based on evidence, not your own words. Legally, this corresponds with your Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination. And courts have consistently recognized that roadside questioning still carries those implications. So, in that first exchange, those first few seconds, you're establishing the tone for everything that follows. Most drivers don't realize it, but this is the moment where the entire trajectory of the stop begins to take shape. And once you see how much depends on that one response, it becomes clear why getting it right matters so much. What makes this so effective and so dangerous isn't just the question itself, it's everything occurring around it. The tone is calm, the setting feels routine, there's no obvious pressure, no raised voices, no sense that anything serious is developing. And that's exactly why it works. Because while you're thinking this is just a normal stop, the officer is already evaluating far more than your answer. They're observing how quickly you respond, whether you hesitate, how confident or uncertain you sound, even how your body language aligns with what you're saying. From a legal standpoint, this is where the encounter starts to take shape. There's a difference between what an officer can prove through observation and what you voluntarily provide through your own words. The moment you offer an admission, even a small one, you've shifted that balance. You've made their job easier. You've filled in gaps that they would otherwise have to justify on their own. But when you use a controlled response, something calm, respectful, and non-committal, you change that dynamic completely. Now, the officer has to rely on what they actually observed, not what you assumed or admitted. And that single shift can limit how far the stop can reasonably go. This isn't about being difficult or evasive, it's about understanding that every encounter has a structure. And once you recognize it, you can move through it without unintentionally creating problems for yourself. Most drivers never realize how much influence they have in those first moments because it doesn't feel like influence. It feels like answering a simple question. But in reality, it's the first point where the direction of the entire stop can either stay narrow or begin to expand. And that expansion is where the second layer comes in. Because once the initial question passes, the stop doesn't just pause, it evolves. This is the part most people don't recognize while it's happening. The officer might start asking what seem like casual, harmless questions. Where are you headed? Where are you coming from? How long have you been driving today? On the surface, it feels like conversation, maybe even an attempt to be friendly. But legally, something very specific is happening in the background. These questions are being used to establish what's known as reasonable suspicion, a threshold that allows an officer to extend the stop beyond its original purpose. And this is where a routine traffic stop can quietly turn into something much longer and much more invasive. Because once that original reason for pulling you over, say speeding, has been addressed, the officer cannot legally keep you there without a new justified reason. That principle was made clear in a Supreme Court case called Rodriguez versus United States. The ruling established that a traffic stop must remain tied to its original purpose, and extending it even by a few minutes requires independent justification. But here's the catch. Most drivers never challenge that extension. Not because they agree with it, but because they don't realize they can. They sit there answering more questions, waiting for the interaction to end, assuming the officer controls the timeline completely. In reality, you have a way to bring the stop back to its legal boundary, and it comes down to one simple direct question. At the appropriate moment, once your documents have been handed over and the reason for the stop has been established, you ask, "Officer, am I free to go once you've finished with my documents?" That's it. No attitude, no escalation, just a clear question. And what that does is subtle but powerful. It signals that you understand the stop has a defined scope and a natural endpoint. It puts the responsibility back on the officer to either conclude the stop or clearly articulate why it's being extended. Compare that to what most drivers do, which is nothing. They wait, they answer, they comply without ever clarifying the timeline. And in that silence, the stop stretches, more questions get asked, more time passes. And by the end of it, what should have been a quick interaction has turned into something far more drawn out. But when you ask that one question, you're not resisting. You're anchoring the interaction to its legal limits. And that alone can change how long you're sitting on the side of that road. To really understand how powerful that one question is, you have to see how little time it actually takes for a stop to cross the line. In the Rodriguez case, the difference wasn't dramatic. There was no high-speed chase, no major escalation, no obvious turning point. It was just an extra 7 to 8 minutes after the original purpose of the stop had already been completed. 7 minutes. That was enough for the Supreme Court to step in and say the extension was unlawful because it wasn't supported by independent, reasonable suspicion. Think about that for a second. Most drivers wouldn't even question a delay like that. It feels minor. You're already pulled over, already waiting, so what's a few more minutes? But legally, those minutes matter. They are the difference between a valid stop and a violation of your rights. And the reason that line gets crossed so often is because nobody challenges it in real time. Not aggressively, not confrontationally, just clearly. When you ask, "Am I free to go once you've finished with my documents?" you're doing exactly what that case protects. You're drawing attention to the timeline. You're making it clear that you understand the stop has a beginning, a purpose, and an end. And in many cases, that's enough to bring things back on track. Officers know the standard, they know the boundary, but if it's never acknowledged, it becomes easy for the stop to drift beyond it without resistance. That's why this question works. It doesn't create conflict, it creates clarity. And clarity in a situation like this is one of the most valuable tools you have. Now here's where everything tightens because there's one moment in a traffic stop where the entire situation can shift in seconds. No buildup, no warning, just a single question that determines what happens next. And it usually sounds casual, almost like it's already been decided. The officer might say, "You mind if I take a quick look inside your vehicle?" Or, "I'm just going to check your car real quick, okay?" The tone is relaxed, the wording is soft, and that final okay is doing more work than most people realize. It's designed to lead you into agreement before you've even had a chance to think it through. Because legally, if the officer doesn't have a warrant and doesn't have probable cause, they need one thing to search your vehicle: your consent. That's it. And once you give it, even casually, even unintentionally, the entire protection that would normally apply is gone. Most drivers don't refuse in that moment, not because they want the search, but because it feels awkward to say no. They think, "I've got nothing to hide," or they assume compliance will make the stop go faster. So they say, "Sure, go ahead." Or they nod, or they step out of the car without realizing what they've just agreed to. And from that point on, the search is legally justified, not because of evidence, but because of permission. Now compare that to a response that keeps everything within your control. When asked, you say clearly and calmly, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches," no explanation, no extra words, just that sentence. And what happens next is immediate. The dynamic changes because now, instead of relying on your permission, the officer has to rely on legal justification. They either need probable cause or the stop proceeds without a search. That one sentence forces the interaction back into a framework where your rights are fully intact. And this isn't a loophole or a trick. It's a principle that's been upheld for decades. In Schneckloth versus Bustamonte, the Supreme Court made it clear that consent must be voluntary, which means it can also be refused calmly, legally, without penalty on its own. And when you understand that, the pressure to agree in that moment starts to disappear because now you're not reacting. You're making a decision, one that keeps the entire situation from expanding beyond what the law actually allows. Once you understand that moment, everything about a traffic stop starts to feel different because what used to seem like a polite request now reveals itself as a turning point. The instant you clearly say, "I do not consent to any searches," you've done something most drivers never do. You've shifted the burden back where it belongs. Up until that point, the interaction often leans on your cooperation to move forward. But once consent is off the table, the officer has to rely on something else entirely, actual articulable probable cause. And if that isn't there, the path forward becomes much narrower. This is why that single sentence carries so much weight. It doesn't escalate the situation and it doesn't create conflict. It simply defines a boundary. And when that boundary is clear, the entire tone of the stop often changes. In reviewing hundreds of real traffic stops, one pattern shows up again and again. Drivers who politely but firmly refuse consent tend to experience shorter, more focused interactions. Not because they're being treated differently, but because the scope of what can legally happen has been limited. There's no longer an open invitation to explore beyond the original reason for the stop. The interaction stays contained, and that's the goal. Not to win the encounter, not to challenge authority, but to move through it without unintentionally expanding it. Most people never see this distinction because they've been taught that cooperation means agreement. But those are not the same thing. You can be fully cooperative, providing documents, following instructions, staying respectful while still declining requests that go beyond what's required. And that balance is where your control comes from. It's not about saying more. It's about knowing exactly what not to say. Now, to see how all of this plays out in real time, picture a completely ordinary situation. You're on the highway, a few hours into a drive, maybe thinking about where you're going to stop next. You drift slightly over the speed limit, nothing dramatic but enough to catch attention. A moment later, you see the lights. You pull over, heart rate ticking up just a bit, but nothing feels out of the ordinary yet. The officer approaches and, like countless stops, before the first question comes, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" In one version of this scenario, the way it happens for most drivers, you answer quickly, trying to be honest and cooperative. "Yeah, I think I was going a little fast. It feels harmless, even responsible." But in that moment, you've just confirmed the violation before anything else has been established. The officer takes your documents, returns to the vehicle, and when they come back, the questions continue. Where are you headed? Where are you coming from? You answer each one, filling the silence, trying to be helpful. A few minutes pass, then comes the shift. "You mind if I take a quick look inside your car?" It's phrased casually, almost like a formality. And because everything has felt routine so far, you say, "Sure." What follows is a 20-plus minute search on the side of the road. Nothing is found, but the time is gone. The stress has built, and the situation has stretched far beyond what you expected when you first pulled over. Now run that same scenario again, but this time with a different approach. The lights come on, you pull over, and the officer asks the same opening question, but instead of guessing, you respond calmly. "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate fully. I don't believe I was doing anything wrong." There's no admission, no added explanation, just a clear, controlled response. You provide your documents, and once the reason for the stop is established, you ask, "Am I free to go once you've finished with my documents?" The question lands simply without tension. The officer proceeds with the citation or warning, whatever the original purpose required. Then comes the same request. "You mind if I take a look inside your vehicle?" And this time you answer just as clearly, "Officer, I do not consent to any searches. No apology, no justification, just the boundary." And from there, the interaction stays exactly where it was meant to stay. No extended delay, no unnecessary escalation. Within minutes, you're back on the road. Same highway, same initial stop. Completely different outcome. And the difference wasn't luck or timing or even the officer. It was 3 sentences, 3 moments where the direction of the stop could have shifted, but didn't. Because you understood what was happening as it was happening. And once you see that contrast side by side, it becomes very clear just how much control most drivers are unknowingly giving away and how easily that can change. At this point, you might be wondering whether all of this is just strategy or if it's actually grounded in something solid. And that's an important distinction because none of what you've seen here relies on loopholes or technicalities. This is built on well-established legal principles that have been clarified over decades through Supreme Court decisions. When you choose not to answer a question with an admission, you're aligning with your Fifth Amendment protection against self-incrimination, which applies even during roadside questioning. In Berkemer versus McCarty, the court made it clear that the pressures of a traffic stop don't erase those protections simply because you're not inside a police station. When you ask whether you're free to go once your documents are processed, you're reinforcing the standard outlined in Rodriguez versus United States, that a stop must remain tied to its original purpose and cannot be extended without independent justification. And when you decline a search, you're exercising a right affirmed in Schneckloth versus Bustamonte, where the court confirmed that consent must be voluntary, meaning it can also be refused. Even the broader framework of brief detentions outlined in cases like Terry versus Ohio supports the idea that these interactions have limits. Taken together, these rulings don't just exist in theory, they shape how every lawful traffic stop is supposed to function in practice. And once you understand that foundation, the entire interaction becomes less uncertain. You're no longer guessing your way through it. You're operating within a structure that already exists to protect you. And this is where a small shift in awareness can make a lasting difference. Because the reality is, most drivers will never be taught this. Not in driver's education, not in routine conversations, not even after years of being on the road. It's something people usually learn the hard way after a situation stretches further than expected. But it doesn't have to be that way. If you've made it this far, you already understand more about how these interactions work than the vast majority of drivers out there. And more importantly, you know how quickly things can change based on just a few words. If you want to go deeper into scenarios like this, especially the ones where officers claim they detect something coming from the vehicle, which introduces a completely different layer of legal complexity, make sure you're following along so you don't miss that breakdown, because that's one of the most misunderstood situations drivers face. And it's where these principles get tested in a very real way. For now, just focus on retaining what you've already learned, because the value isn't just in understanding it here, it's in remembering it when it actually matters. By now, everything comes down to simplicity. Not more information, not more complexity, just 3 clear moments and 3 exact sentences that anchor the entire interaction. Because when those lights come on behind you, you're not going to be thinking about court cases or legal theory, you're going to be reacting. And that's why this has to be easy to recall. The first moment is the question you'll almost always hear. Do you know why I pulled you over? Instead of guessing, instead of filling the silence, you stay controlled and say, "Officer, I'm happy to cooperate fully. I don't believe I was doing anything wrong." No admission, no assumptions, just a steady response that keeps everything grounded. The second moment comes after the purpose of the stop is clear and your documents are in process. This is where time can quietly stretch if nothing is said, so you bring clarity to it with one question. Am I free to go once you've finished with my documents? That single line draws a boundary without creating tension. And the third moment, the one that can change everything instantly, is the search request. However it's phrased, however casual it sounds, your response stays the same. "Officer, I do not consent to any searches." No extra words, no explanations, just a clear decision that keeps your protections intact. 3 sentences, that's it. Not complicated, not aggressive, not confrontational, just precise. And when you put them together, they create a completely different kind of interaction. One where you're cooperative but not exposed, respectful but not unguarded. Because at the end of the day, nothing about this is theoretical. This is about a moment that could happen anytime you're on the road on a long drive, a short commute, a completely ordinary day. And in that moment, the difference between a routine stop and a drawn-out stressful situation often comes down to what you say before you even realize it matters. Most people don't think about it until after the fact, when they're replaying the interaction in their head, wondering how it escalated or why it took so long. But now you won't be in that position. You'll recognize the structure as it's happening. You'll know where the turning points are. And more importantly, you'll know exactly how to move through them without unintentionally making things harder on yourself. If there's one thing to carry with you from this, it's that awareness creates options. It gives you space to respond instead of react. And that alone can change the entire experience. So the next time you see those lights, it won't feel unpredictable. It'll feel familiar, controlled, defined, and you'll know exactly what to say.